The Russian Revolution was not an isolated event, nor a simple spontaneous outbreak of discontent. It was the result of decades of accumulated tension, of ideas, of structures that were slowly cracking, until they could no longer hold. In late 19th century Russia, the Tsarist system maintained a rigid society, deeply unequal. While Europe was moving towards industrialization, Russia remained anchored in agrarian structures, with a subjected peasant population and an emerging working class, increasingly aware of its situation. Karl Marx's ideas began to filter through, not as an exact copy of the European model, but as a forced adaptation to a different reality, where the proletariat was still weak, but the discontent immense. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, would emerge as the key figure, not only as a political leader, but as a strategist, capable of interpreting Marxism and transforming it into a revolutionary tool adapted to Russia. For Lenin, the revolution could not wait. It did not depend on a natural maturity of the system, but of the determined action of an organized, disciplined, relentless vanguard. This is how the party is born. Not like a simple movement, but as a machinery of power, designed to take control of the state. Figures like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, they accompanied this process, contributing structure, theory, and action. But not everyone shared the same vision. Within the socialist movement itself, deep divisions arose. Among those who defended an immediate revolution, and those who were betting on a more gradual transition, the use of the state became the breaking point. For some, it had to be destroyed. For others, used as an instrument of transformation. In this context, the Russian Revolution acquires its unique character. It's not just a class struggle. It is a struggle for control of the very mechanism of power. Meanwhile, Tsarism responded with repression. The secret police, the Okhrana, monitored, infiltrated, persecuted, trying to contain a force that could no longer be stopped. At the end of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th, tensions reach a critical point. The revolutionary movement is organized, strengthens in exile, and connects with European currents, absorbing ideas, tactics, strategies. Lenin, from a distance, build a clear vision, a structure, a plan. And then, the breaking point comes. 1905. A spark, a protest, a crack in the environment, the dress rehearsal of what was to come. Because the Russian Revolution, he wasn't born in a single day. It was built, thought by thought, error after error, until becoming, in one of the most radical transformations of modern history. But the tension did not disappear. In 1905, a movement broke out that would mark the visible beginning of the fracture. A workers' protest led by Pope Gapon advanced towards the Winter Palace seeking answers, seeking justice. The response was fire, shots, chaos, those bodies falling on the snow. The so-called Bloody Sunday not only destroyed the illusion of a protective czar, but it definitively ignited revolutionary consciousness. From that moment on, strikes, riots, and labor organization began to expand. The Tsar attempted to contain the situation by creating the Duma, a limited parliament, a controlled concession designed to calm, not transform. But the system was already weakened. Social tensions, far from disappearing, continued to accumulate. In the countryside, the peasants demanded land; in the cities, the workers demanded rights; and in the power structures the most dangerous crack began to appear: the loss of authority. Then came the final blow. 1914, the Great War. A conflict that not only redefined Europe, but pushed Russia to the limits of its endurance. The army, ill-prepared and ill-equipped, suffered constant defeats, millions of soldiers sent to the front without resources, without strategy. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed, hunger spread, factories were paralyzed, transportation failed, and the state simply could not respond. The war did not unite the country, it tore it apart. In the cities, despair turned to rage. On the front, soldiers began to question orders, and at the heart of power, Tsar Nicholas II became increasingly isolated, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the collapse. In 1917, St. Petersburg becomes the epicenter. The protests begin over bread, but quickly transform into a total rebellion. The workers take to the streets, the soldiers stop obeying, and the system begins to crumble from within. Power remains in the air, and in that vacuum two forces emerge. On the one hand, the provisional government trying to maintain order without completely breaking with the past; on the other, the Soviets, worker and military organizations that represent a new form of power. A duality, a tension, an impossible balance that could not be sustained much longer, and it is precisely at that point that Lenin returns, not as an observer, but as a determined executor. With a clear idea, all power to the Soviets, without concessions, without half measures. Revolution was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable, and the world was about to change forever. But the tension was not resolved after the fall of the Tsar. Power was suspended, divided, fragile. A provisional government tried to maintain order, while another force grew in the streets and in the barracks, the Soviets. Then, Lenin returned. April 1917. He did not return to negotiate, he returned to break the balance. Together with Trotsky he formulated a direct program, without detours, all power to the Soviets, a slogan that transformed doubt into direction. But the revolution was not linear. Within the movement itself there were divisions, doubts, resistance. In July, the Bolsheviks tried to take power, and failed. Lenin had to flee, hide, momentarily disappear from the board. Meanwhile, the provisional government continued to weaken. Kerensky assumed leadership, trying to continue the war, maintain the structure, but the reality was different. The army was decomposing, desertions were increasing, hunger was pressing from the cities, and authority was eroding day after day. Then another threat appeared. Kornilov, a Tsarist general, tried to impose an authoritarian solution, a coup de force to restore order from above. But his attempt failed, and that failure ended up strengthening the Bolsheviks. At the end of October, Lenin understood that the power vacuum had reached its maximum point. It was no longer enough to wait, action had to be taken. Within the party there were still doubts. Kamenev and Zinoviev were opposed to immediate insurrection. Stalin hesitated, but Lenin and Trotsky pushed towards the final decision. And then, the time came. October 1917. The revolutionary forces, organized by Trotsky, advanced on the key points of Petrograd. The Winter Palace was stormed, the old power fell, and a new government emerged under the name of the Council of People's Commissars. The first sign was clear: get out of the war, divide the land, recognize the right of the people to decide their destiny. The new Bolshevik power was still a minority, but it acted with brutal speed, as if it understood that in a revolution, whoever doubts, disappears. But peace had a high price. In Brest-Litovsk, Russia accepted very harsh conditions imposed by Germany. It lost territories, it lost influence, it lost part of its former imperial body. However, for Lenin, the priority was to save the revolution, even if this had to sacrifice space, prestige, and national pride. And while the new regime was trying to consolidate, another war began, the Civil War. The former defenders of Tsarism, liberals, moderate socialists, foreign forces, and white armies, rose up against the Bolsheviks. The country was divided, red against white, revolution against counter-revolution, future against past. Trotsky reorganized the Red Army with iron discipline, former Tsarist officers were used under surveillance, and the war became a total test of survival. In July 1918, the royal family was executed in Ekaterinburg. With that act, the old world was symbolically closed, there was no return possible, there was no longer an imperial figure around which to reconstruct the past. The Civil War was hard, cruel, immense. Foreign powers intervened, there was hunger, repression, violence, and constant pressure on the new Soviet power. But little by little, the Red Army resisted, advanced, and ended up prevailing. Meanwhile, Lenin understood that the Russian Revolution could not remain confined within its borders. If socialism wanted to survive, it had to expand, it had to connect with Europe, it had to become an international movement. Thus was born the Third International, the Communist International. An attempt to definitively break with reformist socialism, and to organize the world revolution from Moscow. But the European Revolution did not come as Lenin expected. Russia was left isolated, surrounded by enemies, forced to build its own path in the midst of wear and tear, war, poverty, and mistrust. After the military victory, another battle came, to rebuild the country. The economy was destroyed, the industry paralyzed, the countryside exhausted, and hunger spread throughout entire regions. Then Lenin promoted the new economic policy, the NEP, a tactical withdrawal, a temporary concession to the market, small property, limited trade, economic incentives. It was not the end of the revolution, it was a maneuver to prevent the revolution from starving. But Lenin was no longer the same. His health began to deteriorate, strokes limited his ability to command, and as his body shut down, another silent struggle began within the party, the fight for succession. Trotsky represented the permanent revolution, the international expansion, the intellectual and military energy of the process. Stalin, on the other hand, advanced from within the apparatus, from the positions, from the organization, from the patient control of the structure. Lenin died in 1924. And with his death a stage was closed. The revolution that had been born as an explosion against Tsarism was now entering a colder, more bureaucratic, harder phase. Power was no longer in the street, nor in the insurrection, nor in the initial cry of the Soviets. Power was beginning to concentrate in the party, in the administration, in the internal mechanisms of the state. Lenin's Russia had destroyed the old empire, had emerged from the war, had survived the counter-revolution, and had created a new model of power. But it had also opened up an immense question: if a revolution born to liberate the people could survive without becoming a machinery of control. And that question would mark the destiny of the 20th century. But the revolution did not end with victory. Another phase began, more complex, more silent, more dangerous: the construction of the new state. The economy was destroyed, the country exhausted, and Lenin understood that socialism could not be imposed on ruins. Thus the NEP was born, a tactical retreat, a controlled opening, small spaces for the market, to breathe, to survive. It was not a surrender, it was a maneuver, a necessary pause to avoid total collapse. While the state maintained control of the key sectors, it allowed a certain private initiative, a strange balance between revolution and reality. And at the same time, something else was beginning to transform: culture, science, thought. Russia was becoming a laboratory, an intellectual explosion, artists, poets, scientists, all pushing the limits of a new society that still had no definitive form. But the power, did not stay still. It reorganized, it concentrated, it hardened. In 1922, a name began to gain weight: Stalin. From an apparently technical position, General Secretary, he began to weave an invisible web, controlling appointments, structures, loyalties. He was not the brightest, nor the most charismatic, but he understood something essential: real power is not always shouted, it is administered. Meanwhile, Lenin was weakening, his health was slowly fading, and with it, the figure that maintained balance within the party began to disappear. And then, the fight began, silent, internal, brutal. Trotsky, the strategist of the revolution, represented the expansion, the permanent revolution, the international impulse. Stalin, on the other hand, represented another idea: consolidating power, building from within, controlling every piece of the system. It was not just a dispute of people, it was a dispute of visions, of the future. After Lenin's death in 1924, the table was left open, and Stalin advanced, step by step, slowly, but surely, isolating rivals, weakening alliances, using the party apparatus itself as a weapon. Trotsky was displaced, then expelled, then erased. The revolution was beginning to devour its own creators. And then, the definitive turn: socialism in one country. The idea of expanding the revolution was replaced by another priority: strengthening the Soviet Union from within, turning it into a self-sufficient power. But that project required sacrifices, enormous, immediate. Collectivization arrived, the countryside transformed by force, millions of peasants forced to integrate into collective farms, resistance, chaos, hunger, but also total control over production. And along with it, accelerated industrialization, factories rising at a brutal pace, cities growing, steel, coal, machinery. The country was transformed in a matter of years, at an immense human cost. The state was no longer just an instrument, it was a constant presence, in the economy, in life, in thought. And within the party, the purge. Suspicion became the norm: former colleagues, historical leaders, key figures of the revolution, accused, tried, eliminated. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, names that had been at the origin, disappeared one by one. The revolution was cleansing itself, or destroying itself from within, depending on how you look at it. Fear settled in, silent, permanent. No one was completely safe. Power no longer needed to be legitimized, it needed to impose itself. Thus the Stalinist dictatorship was born, not as an accident, but as an evolution, a progressive hardening of a system that had been born in the midst of war, chaos, urgency. And while the country advanced, industrially, militarily, it also closed down, politically, socially, humanly. The Soviet Union emerged as a power, strong, organized, imposing, but also as a system where control permeated everything. The revolution had changed the world, it had brought down an empire, it had created a new one. But in that process, something essential had been transformed. Power no longer belonged to the masses, nor to the Soviets, nor to the original impulse. The power, now, had only one face. But control was still not enough. The system needed something more, something to ensure its permanence, its absolute dominance. And then came the next step, the total transformation of the countryside, collectivization. It was not a transition, it was an imposition. Millions of farmers, forced to abandon their lands, their tools, their way of life, to join collective farms, controlled by the state. The resistance was immediate, silent at first, violent later. Animals sacrificed, crops destroyed, desperate decisions in the face of a change that offered no alternative. But the apparatus did not stop. It advanced, it hardened, it crushed any opposition. The result was devastating: hunger, scarcity, entire regions on the verge of collapse. Ukraine turned into one of the harshest scenarios, where life was reduced to surviving one more day. And while the countryside suffered, the city was transformed: giant factories, steel, smoke, constant production. Industrialization advanced at a speed never seen before, driven by 5-year plans, impossible objectives, total pressure. The cost didn't matter, only the result. The country was changing. It was becoming an industrial power, a machine, where each individual was a piece. And within the system, control became absolute. Surveillance, constant. Suspicion, permanent. The purges began to spread, not only against leaders, but against anyone: officials, military, ordinary citizens. An accusation, a suspicion, a word, could mean the end. The trials, public, exemplary, showed the world an image of order, but they hid a much darker reality: forced confessions, sentences decided in advance, systematic elimination of any threat, real or imaginary. Fear stopped being a tool, to become the natural environment of the system. And yet, the state grew, it became stronger, it armed itself. Because while all this was happening, an external threat was beginning to take shape. Europe was changing: new tensions, new conflicts, the world was again approaching the brink. And the Soviet Union was preparing. It had gone from being an empire in ruins, to an industrial, military, organized power, capable of resisting, capable of imposing itself. But the price had been immense. Millions of lives sacrificed in the process, generations marked by fear, by discipline, by silence. The system had achieved what it sought: control, stability, power. But in that achievement, he had completely redefined his essence. The revolution was no longer a movement. It was a structure. And within that structure, the individual no longer decided. I just obeyed.